What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to the JW Football Show. Today we're going to do something a little bit different than what I've been doing over the past couple of weeks. Today really is what is going to be a free agency recap, right? I'm recording this about 5 o'clock on March 13th. We've had about a week now of the legal tampering period, and now a couple days of like the official signing period. So there's been a whole bunch of changes, a lot of crazy kind of situations, especially the Max Crosby thing. Have taken place over the past, few days. So really what this episode is going to be, we're just going to go through team by team, look at, what have they brought in, who have they lost, kind of talk about, what are my opinions on their offseason so far, and then maybe what do they still need to address, through the draft and maybe through some possible trades. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on each team. It's really just so that everybody gets, the information at once and you guys can kind of interact. Please let me know, your favorite team. What do you think about their free agency so far? And what do you want them to do in the draft? So without further ado, let's get right into it, starting with the Arizona Cardinals. So obviously the Cardinals are in kind of this rebuilding period, right? They just, released Kyler Murray, hired a new coach. They're in a bit of a rebuild / retool. We'll kind of see. They haven't really done anything unbelievable in free agency so far. I do really like the Isaac Seumalo signing. If you watch my Seahawks offseason episode, that was the guy I really wanted them to go after. So I do like that a lot, especially for an O-line that struggled. But other than that, it's kind of just a lot of mid-tier to low-tier, free agency signings. They bring in Gardner Minshew. I know everybody, Gardner Minshew's a fan favorite. Obviously not your QB of the future, but he'll probably start some games this year. Kendrick Bourne actually getting, a pretty penny, right? Almost $12 million to be this team's probably wide receiver 3. We'll kind of see. Depends on what they do in the draft. Tyler Algier I like a lot. I was kind of hoping for his sake he went somewhere where he'd, be more of the top guy, but I think him and James Conner is a nice duo. Andrew Wingard, good depth. Matt Pryor, good depth. But really not a whole lot going on with Arizona. I'm especially concerned, or I guess, have questions about their quarterback situation. I feel like if you go into the year with Jacoby Brissett again, and then, Gardner Minshew as a second option, you're kind of throwing the year away, right? And I know that next year's quarterback class is going to be a lot better than this one. I know it's what everybody says every year, but I really do think next year is going to be a lot better. So I think they're really, shooting for that. But so far, I haven't really seen them make any improvements to the roster. Obviously, with a strong draft, that can change. But I think they're going to be in a similar spot, this year as they were last year. So yeah, I think we'll just, I'd give the Cardinals, maybe a B- for free agency so far. I understand that with a new coach, it's kind of hard to, turn everything around in 1 year. I think they've made some solid signings, but nothing, to turn the ship around quite yet. Next, we got the Atlanta Falcons. Another team that really hasn't done anything like crazy so far. The only thing that's like really worth noting is bringing in Tua as, competition for Michael Penix. I'm not going to quote it, but if you look at Behan, his Twitter, he had a really funny tweet about their quarterback room. I get it, right? I do think you need a veteran presence in there to kind of compete / push / mentor Michael Penix. I'm not sure if Tua is the best guy to do that. I think him and Michael Penix have a lot of similar problems, right? With the injuries and, they're both left-handed, I just don't really know how much Tua is going to help improve this team. I'm not really sure if he's a step up, and I'm not really sure if he's the guy you want mentoring your young quarterback, but it's, a 1 year, $1.3 million deal. Fortunately, the Falcons get to do that because the Dolphins still owe him so much money, so he's willing to take that, low of a contract. I do think franchise tagging Kyle Pitts made sense. It was a career year this year, so that makes sense. Darnell Mooney, my guy, money with 2 O's. Everybody knows how much I absolutely adore Darnell Mooney. But I think they do a good job replacing him with very similar type players. Jahan Dotson obviously coming over from Philly. Olamide Zaccheaus coming over from my Bears. I think those will be fine replacements for a guy like Darnell Mooney. I think my favorite signing so far for them is actually Azeez Ojulari. He's kind of bounced around since his early days as, I want to say, a second-round pick for the Giants. He just can't stay healthy, right? When he's on the field, I think he's actually a pretty productive pass rusher. It's just a matter of how consistently are you getting that. But I don't mind the flyer, especially with, all the uncertainty around James Pierce Jr. Not going to go too much into that, but, if you haven't heard of that situation, look it up. Not great. Not sure if he'll be on the team again. But I think Azeez Ojulari is a nice, kind of dart throw at the position, at least for depth. Obviously, they lose Kirk Cousins. Everybody kind of knew that was going to come. just, kind of a swing and a miss a couple of years ago in free agency. It is what it is. I would give the Falcons, kind of similar to the Cardinals, a B-, right? I don't think you have any, franchise-changing type of additions, but you're also not really losing anybody that's, changing the franchise either. Again, similar to the Arizona Cardinals, you bring in a new coach. Hard to turn the ship around in a year, so I think they've done some solid stuff so far. Next, one of the main events, the Baltimore Ravens, right? Obviously, very early in the free agency, kind of tampering period. They trade those 2 first-round picks for Max Crosby. And then a couple days later, Max Crosby reportedly fails a physical. The trade gets voided. The Ravens back out. And then, they very quickly pivot to Trey Hendrickson, giving him 4 years, $112 million. I like Trey Hendrickson. He was a guy that I really, would have considered for Chicago. I'm very happy they didn't do this for a guy that's on the wrong side of 30, has had just this past year, really struggled with injuries. To give him, almost $30 million a year at this point in his career, I hope it works out for them, obviously, but I think that's a lot of money. Obviously, you can't see it here. I'm not sure why PFF doesn't have that updated. Obviously, they lose Tyler Linderbaum to free agency. He goes to the Raiders. It was supposed to be a flop between him and Crosby, but he is, in fact, going to play in Las Vegas. They lose Isaiah Likely. He goes to the Giants. There's more I'm forgetting. Oh, they lost. He went to the Patriots. I'm forgetting his name. The edge rusher that went to the Patriots. But yeah, they've had a lot of out and not a whole lot of impactful in. I do think Trey Hendrickson will be at least a good player if he's healthy. I do really like the Jalen Hawkins signing, a guy that was, critical for Mike Vrabel's, Super Bowl defense this year. I'm surprised he actually didn't get a little bit more money after a career year, but I think that makes a lot of sense for them. Chidobe Awuzie, they re-signed on a 1-year deal. I think that's just fine. Snoop Huntley seems to be the guy there, so he's in. I think John Simpson will be a nice replacement for Falele. So, overall, I think a lot of people are very disappointed with the Ravens so far, just because, there was this promise of Crosby and they lose Linderbaum. But I think they're going to be just fine. Another team, again, that is going through a coaching change. I think a lot of the changes they needed were philosophical and not necessarily, personnel based. So we'll see how that goes. I'll give the Ravens, I guess, a C+ so far, just because, it seemed rich to give up 2 firsts for Max Crosby, especially with them picking at 14, and then they back out. It's just a weird situation. They haven't made too many crazy additions, but that is very heavily dependent on what happens with Trey Hendrickson. So we'll kind of see on that. Next, one of the, more key players as far as some of the top tier teams go in the Buffalo Bills. Obviously, they trade for DJ Moore from my Chicago Bears. I love DJ Moore. I talked about it in my Bears episode. I wasn't dying for him to get traded or anything like that. However, for a 2nd-round pick for a guy that's, almost 30 years old who, by the end of the year wasn't our top option as a receiver, we save, a pretty hefty chunk of money against the cap. We get a 2nd-round pick in return. I just think that offer's too good to pass up. I really hope he does well on the Bills, and I think he will be their number 1 option. And I think that makes a lot of sense for them. But I was very pleased with the return. So I think for both sides, it makes sense. The Bills are desperate for a receiver. They got one. So bringing back Connor McGovern, that was huge. Keep some continuity among that interior offensive line. Bradley Chubb coming in on a 3-year, $43 million deal. Obviously, he gets cut by the division rival Dolphins earlier in the offseason, excuse me. Another guy that just can't stay healthy, So for $43 million over 3 years, that's a little rich for me. They are going to seemingly be making that switch to a 3-4 defense as opposed to a 4-3. So I think he does, fill a need there. I think he can play, that wide outside linebacker role. It's just a matter of if he's healthy or not. D. Alford, that's fine. I'm not sure if he was great for the Falcons, but I guess he's a replacement for Teron Johnson. Dawson Knox gets his extension. We're not quite sure on the exact money there. At least it's not up here. I'm sure it's nothing crazy. CJ Gardner Johnson, again, coming over from my Bears, 1 year up to $6 million. Nothing crazy there. I was surprised they were willing to trade Teron Johnson. I feel like, to me, he's been one of the better nickels in the NFL over the past, half decade. I guess he is, creeping up on 30, so it is what it is. They didn't really get much in return, but I do still think the Bills have some significant additions that need to be made, especially along the defense. Obviously Jim Leonard's taken over there, so we'll kind of see how his philosophy shows up through their personnel. I'll give them a B so far. Haven't necessarily lost anybody earth-shattering. The one guy that's not on here is the guard. David Edwards is his name. Went over to New Orleans and got a pretty good, bag over there. I think that's going to hurt. You have to think about who's going to play guard in his place. But we'll kind of see. I think overall, I keep doing this like kind of cop-out type grade for these teams. But again, like a B-. I do think they did a good job addressing some of their needs, but they still do need some impact players, especially along the defense. Next, the Panthers. Sorry, let me scroll up a little bit. One of the biggest spenders in free agency so far, giving Jalen Phillips 4 years, $120 million. If I were to be doing an episode specifically on my favorite and least favorite signings so far, unfortunately, I do think that'd be one of my least favorite, only because I don't think the value matches the player's production. Jalen Phillips is very talented, right? I think he's a former first-round pick. He's shown to be very good. It's just he has such significant health concerns. Obviously last year, I guess technically was like the most productive, quote-unquote, year of his career, and it was really just that back half with Philly, and then he gets, $30 million a year. He was another guy that I was like, maybe Chicago will check in on. Glad we didn't do that, right? That's too much to me. I hope he's, able to stay healthy, and can prove me wrong. But I just don't love that. I love the Devin Lloyd signing. They've been so weak in the kind of the spine of their defense, especially at that middle linebacker position. Devin Lloyd was by far the best one on the market, and they're able to bring him in on a relatively manageable deal, only 3 years, $45 million. I think that makes a lot of sense for them. I think he'll be really good there. They just today, a couple hours ago, brought in Rasheed Walker. Obviously, Ike Ekwonu suffers that torn patellar tendon. Will miss all of maybe, come back for the playoffs if they make it. But he's going to be out for a significant chunk of next year. I think Rasheed Walker makes a lot of sense there. Maybe he's your answer long-term, depending on what happens with Taylor Moton and Ike Ekwonu. Maybe he can kind of switch over to the right side. We'll see. Kenny Pickett to be a backup. That's whatever. He's been on like 5 teams in 5 years. John Mechie I really like a lot, reuniting him with his college quarterback in Bryce Young. I think he'll be a solid maybe wide receiver 4. They do lose Cade Mays, which I'm not sure why that's not on the departures list, but he played really well down the stretch for Carolina. Luke Fortner, not necessarily the cream of the crop when it comes to interior offensive linemen, but at least serviceable. So I think, you do a good job at least getting like a stopgap in there, and then are maybe looking for, a longer term answer in the draft. Overall, I'd probably give the Panthers like a B+, just because I do really like the Devin Lloyd and Rasheed Walker signings, especially. What's holding this back from being an A is really just how much money they gave Jalen Phillips. So moving on with my Bears, another team that's been pretty active. Obviously, we get the sudden retirement of Drew Dahlman. Ryan Poles just recently said, he's not going to get into it. It was something that seemed to catch him and the rest of, the front office by surprise. Not sure what happened there. He was a great player for us for the year we had him. But that is quite the blow. Obviously, we just talked about trading DJ Moore and then cutting Tremaine Edmonds. I think that was something that pretty much all Bears fans had come to terms with, that he was not going to be on the team next year. That's just fine. He lands with the Giants. I think that's a good spot for him. We trade for Garrett Bradbury shortly after losing Drew Dahlman. Not an elite center by any means. He's not as good of an overall player as Dahlman, but I think he's a great scheme fit, right? He's been a very good outside zone blocker, especially throughout his career. And that's kind of what Ben Johnson hangs his hat on. At least he did this past year. So assuming that we have, and we will, right? Assuming that system's going to be the same, I think Bradbury makes a lot of sense in that way. I do still think you're looking for a guy long term, but at the very least, he'll be serviceable this year. Kobe Bryant, I think, just by Seahawks fans' reactions, Seahawks fans were so upset that Kobe Bryant got let out of the building. So I think that says a lot about who he is as a player and as a teammate. 3 years, $40 million for him. Obviously, we have a huge safety need with Byard and Brisker both walking. And you can even add Jonathan Owens into that mix. I think he'll be a really good player. I think he fits, kind of that Dennis Allen versatility that he looks for. So that makes a lot of sense. Devin Bush coming off of a career year, an all-pro caliber year, in my opinion. A little bit undersized, but his ability to come downhill, fill the run. He's definitely improved in pass coverage over his 5 or 6 year career now. Definitely has all the athletic ability in the world. I'm hoping he can keep that up. Neville Gallimore, really just an interior rotational pass rusher for us. We do still need to shore up that run game, but I think he does add some nice interior pressure potential as far as those passing downs go. DeMarco Jackson, the guy I was thrilled to be re-signed. If you watch my Bears episode, you know how I feel about DeMarco Jackson. Khalif Raymond, another guy that just seemed like he was going to be a Bear, kind of reuniting with Ben Johnson to be, that wide receiver, 3, 4, 5, depending. And hopefully a very, very solid returner for us. We'll kind of see how that goes. Braxton Jones was one of the most surprising, signings of free agency for me. He was a guy I almost surely thought was going to walk just because, some of that, I guess you could call it adversity this year with Chicago. But to get him back on a 1-year, $5 million deal, he's shown that he's, a top, 32 caliber tackle in the NFL at points. That didn't necessarily come to fruition last year. But I think, betting on, a possible, kind of return to that form is worthwhile for just $5 million a year. And then Jedrick Wills, another kind of dart throw at that left tackle position. I love it. He was a serviceable starter in his time with Cleveland. Obviously sat out all of last year due to injury. But to have, Braxton, Jedrick, and Theo kind of all competing for that left tackle spot in camp, I think makes a lot of sense. I'm really hoping that one of those guys can kind of take that job over and hold it down, at least until Ozzie Trapillo's back. So yeah, overall, I'd probably give the Bears like an A-. I do still think we have some pretty clear, edge rusher, run-stopping defensive tackle, and, maybe a strong safety need. But I think overall we've done a good job adding impact players. We wanted to get faster, and we did, so I'll definitely take it. Moving right on, another one of the biggest spenders in the Bengals. Gave Brian Cook a whole bunch of money. He's been a really good player for a really good Chiefs defense. They had a huge safety need. I think they filled it really well with Brian Cook. Boye Mafe, I'm actually this kind of one proved me right. I gave him a very similar contract in my Packers episode, and he gets it instead with Cincinnati. But I think he's going to be a really, really, good signing to get him for, $10 million less a year than Jalen Phillips went for. I think is going to prove to be a steal. I think he's exactly what the Bengals needed, and I'm really excited to see how that turns out for them. Jonathan Allen, after getting cut by Minnesota, the Bengals had such a bad defense that there's really not an addition they could make that I'd hate. But I think Jonathan Allen as a veteran defensive tackle presence makes all the sense in the world. Dalton Risner, a guy that really made a name for himself this year. All the players were pounding the table to get him back. So it's nice to get him back on a cheap 1-year deal. Orlando Brown, it was very, I guess, polarizing, kind of, represented himself with this extension. Good for him, right? He got his money. He got his 2-year extension. He's been at least an okay tackle for them. You got to protect Joe Burrow by all means necessary, and he's helped do that. So I think that's just fine. Obviously, they lose Trey Hendrickson. Everybody knew that was coming. It is what it is. They lose Geno Stone, who was a swing and a miss a few years ago. But yeah, I'd probably give the Bengals an A, man. I think they've addressed some of their biggest needs and given themselves a little bit more freedom as far as where do they go in the draft. I think a lot of people just had them kind of penciled in. They're taking an interior defensive lineman or a safety. They still very well might, right? But I think they have a little bit more flexibility now, so I really like what they've done. Cleveland, kind of the story there offseason, really just overhauling that offensive line. They trade for and extend Titus Howard. Based on that money, I'm assuming he's going to be their right tackle. We'll kind of see. He's played guard in the past. But to give him, $20 million a year, sounds like he'll probably be their right tackle. Zion Johnson, shout out my buddy AB. I wanted to get to a Chargers episode, and we would have talked about this. I really love Zion Johnson coming out of Boston College. I believe it was Boston College, former first-round pick. But Zion Johnson was a guy that got the worst offensive line in the league. Let him walk. Like, what does that tell you, right? Like, how good is he really? And then the Browns, in true Browns fashion, gave him $50 million. I really hope for the Browns' sake and for his sake he plays well. I'm not sure if I'm too confident in that happening, but we'll see. Elton Jenkins, after getting cut by Green Bay, I think this makes a lot of sense. He's been a very versatile, veteran interior offensive lineman. Makes a lot of sense for a unit that's going to, obviously go under some very significant changes. Quincy Williams, who, was an all-pro just a couple of years ago, to get him in there to replace Devin Bush, I think makes a lot of sense. They re-signed former Bear Tevin Jenkins. He was okay this year. Signed Jack Stoll. Kind of is what it is. Overall, I'd probably give the Browns a B+, A-. I don't love the Zion Johnson signing, but I do love the process of kind of overhauling that offensive line. Again, giving yourself a little bit more flexibility in the draft. But so yeah, depending on how that Zion Johnson signing works out, this could be like an A. For now, I'll give it like kind of that B+, A- range. Dallas Cowboys franchise tagging George Pickens made all the sense in the world. He was just too good last year to let walk. Jalen Thompson, has quietly been a really good player for the Cardinals next to Budda Baker. So to get him for $13 million, I think was really, really good. Or I guess $12 million, excuse me. I think that makes a lot of sense. They had a safety need. They fill it with the veteran. I think he'll be a good player for them. They trade for Rashawn Gary. I know a couple of you guys were in my comments on the Packers episode saying, Gary doesn't really have any trade value, or if he does, it's for, a very late round pick. He actually went for, very similar to kind of what I was expecting him to go for. I actually do kind of like the process for the Cowboys. It's very Cowboys-esque to take a bet on a former, top recruit, top draft prospect. So I think it was time for Rashawn Gary to leave Green Bay, but I do like the landing spot for him. I think he kind of makes sense there. So hopefully that works out for them. They just signed Kobe Durant. I think that's fine as a rotational corner. PJ Locke, again, rotational safety. He'll be fine. Sam Howell, a lot of people call my lookalike. He'll be their backup. That is what it is. Trading Oso Digizua was interesting. I guess it makes sense after, acquiring Quinnen Williams, but he was a really good player. So to send him off to San Francisco was a little bit interesting, but I think it was a third-round pick in return. So decent value there. I guess they just didn't want to have that much money invested in the interior D-line, which, you can agree or disagree, but that happened. I think it's decent value in return, so we'll see if that works out. Overall, I'd probably give the Cowboys an A-. Again, I think they've addressed some of their big needs, got George Pickens back. Overall, it's pretty good. Broncos bring back J.K. Dobbins for 2 years, $20 million. That's a lot of money for a guy that can't stay healthy. He was really good for them with R.J. Harvey as kind of that 1-2. But again, that is kind of a lot of money. So, hopefully that works out for them. But I'm a little wary of that. Jaquan McMillan they tendered him, which, if for those of you that don't know what that means, it's, if he is to sign somewhere else, they would be receiving a pick as compensation for that. He's been one of the best nickels in the league over the past few years. I think it made a lot of sense to bring him back. Their guard, I don't even know how to pronounce that, to be honest. Alex Palshevsky, maybe. He's okay. They extended him a little bit earlier in the year. Justin Strnad, I think, made a lot of sense. 3 years, up to $20 million. That's good money for him. He's a good player. Troutman, one of the better blocking tight ends in the league. They get him back. He's kind of a Sean Payton guy, so that made sense. Alex Singleton back makes sense, especially when they cut Dre Greenlaw. Dre Greenlaw just didn't work out for them. I was really excited about that signing when it happened. He's just not the same player he used to be. I think, the health just isn't really worth betting on for them at this point. So that is what it is. I'd give the Broncos a B. I think, they haven't really been active, and I think a lot of people are frustrated by that. I think people were hoping they'd make this big push to get over the hump and make the Super Bowl next year. But they've re-signed a lot of their guys. Clearly their team is good enough to compete, and they just have to keep hitting on their draft picks. So I actually don't mind it. Don't force the issue. Trust your process. So, yeah, I'll give them a B for that. I think it's been solid. The Lions, a team that's maybe, been a little bit underwhelming as far as free agency goes. I think Cade Mays makes sense. It's a reasonable contract. He was a good player for the Panthers last year. Pacheco is just kind of a poor man's David Montgomery, in my opinion. I guess it's a fine replacement for a cheap deal, but we'll kind of see how that works out. Juice Scruggs, getting him in return for David Montgomery. Juice Scruggs just isn't that good, to put it, very bluntly. He hasn't been that good of a player so far yet in his career, so, you're really betting on some improvement there. Rock Ya-Sin, Christian Izien, fine depth pieces. Tyler Conklin, fine depth. I think I'd give the Lions like a C+ so far. I don't really know if they've gotten better at all. I think they've lost some key players, some key contributors that have been on those good teams the past few years. So I'm just not really, super intrigued by the additions they've made. So they'll really have to hit their draft picks. The Packers, a team that, man, they've lost quite a bit at this point. You don't even have a guy like Romeo Doubs listed on here. They cut, Nate Hobbs after just a year of having him. They traded for Zaire Franklin. I think that makes a lot of sense. He's a good player. They get rid of Kobe Wooten. That's fine, right? They don't really need another undersized defensive tackle, so it is what it is. I think re-signing Sean Ryan makes sense. I had that happening in my Packers episode. Javon Hargrave, bringing him in makes a lot of sense. Another guy that's kind of bounced around a little bit since being on the Eagles Super Bowl team. But he's still a good player. He's kind of in that back end of his career. But they do need another defensive tackle presence, and to get a veteran like that in there, especially one with some pass rush upside, I think makes some sense. St. Juice is just such a Packers player. That big, long, athletic corner. He's an okay player. I think that makes some sense. We'll see what kind of role he can carve out for himself. We already talked about the rest of these guys that kind of left. Overall, I'd probably give the Packers we'll call it a B minus, C plus. I don't know if they've made any like crazy additions. I think Zaire Franklin and Javon Hargrave will be solid, but they've lost quite a bit too, especially as far as, guys they've kind of built around over the past, call it 3 or 4 years. But we'll see. I think they're really trying to play that compensatory pick market. I had somebody in my comments on that episode talking about that, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So it just, again, kind of depends on how their draft ends up. The Texans, a team that's made a lot of additions. A couple that I really like. Braden Smith coming over from the Colts. I'm not really sure why the Colts let him walk, especially to, a division rival. That makes it sting a little bit worse. They do have that tackle out of Miami from last year that I think they do have belief in as a replacement, so hopefully that works out. But I think that the Texans, like I talked about with some of these other teams, bringing in a guy like Braden Smith to start right away at right tackle just gives you so much more flexibility in the draft, and that's something I'm a big fan of. It allows you to just go best player available and keep building a really talented roster. So that's a huge pickup. Reed Blankenship makes a lot of sense, man. Every time they make an addition on defense, it's just like you kind of roll your eyes. Like, this is already the best defense in the league, and now they get, a really solid safety in Reed Blankenship to add to that defensive back mix. And unfortunately, breaking up, the exciting whites with Cooper DeJean, but he's a really good player. I think that makes sense. They take a flyer on a former first-round pick in Logan Hall. We'll see what that can turn into. They trade for David Montgomery after cutting Joe Mixon. So, yeah, I think I'd give the Texans like an A. I've really enjoyed what they've done. I think they've made, again, I love the teams that, you don't necessarily have to, break the bank for players, but do such a good job of, limiting their dire needs so that they can take BPA in the draft. I really like that approach. So the Texans, I think, are in that boat. I really like what they've done. The Colts, I think the thing that stands out is right here. 2 years, $88 million for Daniel Jones off an Achilles tear. The Colts kind of have to go all in now after trading for Sauce. They gave up a lot of top-tier capital. That tells me, you're really pushing for a Super Bowl window. In Daniel Jones, you trust, I guess. I'm not really sure if he's the guy that's going to get you there. Alec Pierce, I'm really glad they re-signed. It's for a lot of money. Alec Pierce is a really good player and has become a premier deep threat. I think they could have got him for a lot less had they got this done earlier in the year. But nonetheless, they get him back. Arden Key is a good signing from the division rival Titans. And then they trade Michael Pittman to the Steelers. I think that's fine. I think Michael Pittman's kind of phased out of this offense. I think he's absolutely behind, Pierce, Downs, and Tyler Warren. I think he was kind of their fourth option last year. So I think that's fine. You ship him for some late round draft picks to Pittsburgh. That's just fine. Obviously, we talked about trading Zaire Franklin away. I think they have a pretty decent linebacker need now, but that's nothing you can't address in the second round. So I'd give the Colts like a B minus. Again, I keep doing that. I know it's kind of a cop-out answer, but I think I don't love the Daniel Jones signing, but they kept their good players. Alec Pierce makes a lot of sense. So we'll kind of see how that comes to fruition. The Jags, one of the least active teams so far. Actually, their GM just did an interview today where he, admittedly said, we're really playing that compensatory pick market, looking towards the 2027 draft. I think that's fine. They didn't really have that many free agents. Obviously Devin Lloyd walks, but they bring back Monteric Brown. He's been a really good player for them. That makes sense. I think he got the exact contract I said he was going to get with Seattle, but stays with Jacksonville, so that's cool. Chris Rodriguez Jr. after losing ETN. Oh, yeah, now that I'm saying that, I said they didn't lose that much. Now that I'm saying it out loud, they actually kind of lost some key contributors, right? You lose ETN, you lose Devin Lloyd. I'm not sure why they're not on here, but Rodriguez is a fine, rotational guy. Johnny Munt is what it is. I'd give the Jags, we'll call it, I feel like I sounded pretty happy about this, but now that I'm saying it out loud, I might be more at about a C. I think they lose two of their, best players in Devin Lloyd and Travis Etienne. Thankfully, they're not necessarily at premium positions. I think linebacker and running back are two positions you can, pretty confidently replace in this year's draft. So hopefully they're able to do that. We'll see, but I think for now I'll give them a C just because they lost good players and didn't really bring in too many difference makers. The Chiefs, my buddy Lano, if you're hearing this, I know you'd have some choice words for the Chiefs free agency so far. Kenneth Walker was like very early into free agency, a huge splash they made. That makes all the sense in the world, right? They need a better run game. The Seahawks didn't bring back, their Super Bowl MVP. The Chiefs take advantage, sign him to a 3-year deal. I think that makes sense. Having Kelsey come back is interesting. I wasn't positive he'd be back, but on 1 year, $12 million, you would think that this is going to be it now, unless Taylor's mad at him and says, just keep raking it in, man. I'm sure he'll do whatever she says. So we'll see if he can, end strong. Alohi Gilman, I really like. He was the guy I was interested in for Chicago. My buddy Lano's not as big of a fan of him. But it is what it is. It's fine. Excuse me. I believe Kairos Tonga will be a good player for them. He really made a name for himself in New England this year. I think he's going to make a lot of sense next to Chris Jones as more of that true run stopper. Kader Kohu missed pretty much all of last year with injury, but has shown to be a really good nickel in the NFL. So hopefully after losing Trent McDuffie and pretty much all of their defensive backs, he can be a guy that, is able to make an impact. Bringing in Tyquan Thornton, that's fine. Just a pure deep threat. Hopefully he can continue building some of that rapport with Patrick Mahomes. Obviously they trade Trent McDuffie. I'm not in the business of getting rid of really good players, so I didn't love it. But if you are going to trade him, getting the draft capital they did in return, starting with, I believe it's pick 29 this year, that's not bad, right? You get a first-round pick, in return, but you lose 3 of your 3 starting cornerbacks, and one of them you traded away. Not necessarily the approach that I would have taken, but I'm not getting paid to be the team's general manager, so maybe they know something I don't. We'll see how that comes, and goes. I'm going to give them a C for now. I think they've lost. Losing Trent McDuffie sucks. They don't have their other corners on here. Their names are escaping me right now, but Jalen Watson was one of them. Like, just losing all of that at once feels like it's going to be a problem. We'll see if they can address it in the draft. Raiders, holy money, right? They've given out a lot of money, a lot of which was to really good players, right? Linderbaum, one of, if not the best centers in the NFL. That's a lot of money, but he's a really good player, like I said, so you can't be too upset about it. Eric Stokes, I think, played his way into that contract. I think 3 years, $30 million was well deserved for him. Jalen Nailor was a guy I really liked. I was kind of hoping he went somewhere where he'd, be more surely the top 2 option. We'll kind of have to see how those Raiders draft picks from last year play. Jack Besh, Dante Thornton. We'll see if they can carve out a bigger role with Kubiak there now, but Nailor in the mix, I think, makes a lot of sense. Kwity Paye, a guy who's, I would say has been a little bit underwhelming as far as first-round picks go, but is a versatile defensive lineman for a defense that was just absolutely terrible last year. Nakobe Dean I really, really like. Another guy that struggled with injuries a little bit, but has been really good. He was just kind of the odd man out in Philly. I think that makes a lot of sense. And then they reunite him with his former Georgia Bulldogs teammate, Quay Walker. Again, if you watch my Packers episode, I don't like Quay Walker. I think he's just purely a downhill kind of interior run-stopping linebacker. And I just don't know how much value that really holds in today's game. I know there's been kind of a resurgence in the run game over the past 2 years. But to give him $40 million over 3 years, man, I'm just not confident that contract's going to age well. That's really the only one that I'm really not happy with. I think trading for Teron Johnson was really, really smart. Again, just trying to get in solid players onto a defense that was just awful. They trade away Geno Smith. He was just terrible last year. I'm laughing because, I have a buddy that sends me memes about Geno Smith and maybe some of his alternative pastimes. I'm not going to go too much into that on a public video, but overall, I'd probably give the Raiders an A-. You have to take into account that they're going to have Max Crosby on this team now, and it seems like he's going to stay a Raider, which after all of that is pretty unbelievable, after it seemed like he'd be on any team but the Raiders. But the money will work with him coming back. He's going to be on a better team this year. You could add in Fernando Mendoza into this mix too, so I do think the Raiders are trending in the right direction. But yeah, we'll kind of see. We'll see if they hold on to Max Crosby. Maybe he gets dealt again in the coming weeks. But I think they've made some good additions so far outside of Quay Walker. The Chargers, I think the team that people have been the most frustrated with, just haven't really made that many impactful signings. They did bring in Dalvin Tomlinson just like an hour or two ago. That makes a lot of sense. That was definitely a position of need going into the NFL draft. But to bring in a guy like that on a 1-year deal has been a really, really productive interior defensive lineman for you. Or not for you, for the Cardinals the past few years. That made a lot of sense. Bringing in Khalil Mack, I was really hoping we'd be able to reunite him with Chicago. He goes back to LA with what presumably will be one of his, if not his last year of his career. Tyler Biadasz, I really like Tyler Biadasz. Go Badgers, Wisconsin guy. I was hoping the Bears would maybe bring him in. I think that makes a lot of sense, and he doesn't count against the compensatory pick market. So that was great. Charlie Kolar goes from one Harbaugh brother to the next. He's kind of that more traditional wide tight end compared to Rondé Gadsden, who's really a big slot receiver. So I think that pairing will be really nice. Cole Strange, a former first-round pick somehow, to join the offensive line. We'll see. Maybe Mike McDaniel can get the best out of him. He kind of follows his former head coach to LA. We'll see. Keaton Mitchell adds some much-needed speed to the running back room. Obviously, you have a Marion Hampton, but Keaton Mitchell's kind of that change of pace, maybe receiving back. Alec Ingold, another Wisconsin guy, go Badgers. I think he's a good player, at least in the Mike McDaniel offense. If they use him the same way, I think he'll be productive. Bringing back Trey Pipkins, excuse me. Not sure how that happened, but it is what it is. Overall, I'd probably give the Chargers like a C. I like that they brought in Biadish. I think Kohler's a solid signing. Other than that, I think, you have a pretty significant edge rusher need now. I know Tuli Tuipulotu's a good player. You have Khalil Mack for a year. Obviously, you let Owe walk. So we'll see how they attack the draft. They don't have that many picks. So they're really going to have to hit. So I'm going to give them kind of a C for now. Obviously, with room to improve depending on some of these guys that are a little bit more on the fence. The Rams are really going for it, man. They're really trying to push this Super Bowl window in, kind of the end of the Matthew Stafford era. Obviously, like we mentioned earlier, they trade for and extend Trent McDuffie, making him the highest paid defensive back of all time. Good for him, man. I think he's a really, really good player. Is he the best defensive back of all time? No, but in probably a couple months, that will no longer be the top contract. It's just how the market is. They also bring in former Chief Jalen Watson. I think that makes a lot of sense. They clearly, were able to identify a very glaring need in their defensive back, room as a whole this year. I think you can kind of attribute, them not winning or making and winning the Super Bowl to their defensive backs. So I think they're really hammering that. Bringing Cameron Curl, I keep saying bringing back Cameron Curl, re-signing him 3 years, $36 million. He gets less money than Kobe Bryant did. So I think that's a really good contract for them. This roster is just unbelievable now, just really no holes. I'm going to give them an A for what they've done so far. Just really hammering a glaring need. You love that. They still have a top 15 pick from the Falcons somehow. So this team's definitely going to be, in a Super Bowl contention going into this year. The Dolphins, I'm really not sure what the Dolphins' goal is here because with signings like Willie Gay, Uche, Atwell, Tolbert, those are very, I would guess, synonymous with a team that just is kind of, going to tank this year, hopefully get their franchise quarterback. I think, though, that makes sense. That process makes sense with a new coach coming in. But then they give Malik Willis over $20 million a year to presumably be their starter. I really like Malik Willis. I was kind of hoping he'd go to Arizona just because Arizona's a little bit closer to competing, in my opinion. I just don't know if Malik Willis in his career fits the timeline of like a team that's very clearly trying to lose. Like you get rid of Tua, Tyreek, Minka, Chubb, Sanders, Ingold, like a lot of guys that have played, and not to say that it's been working out, but a lot of guys that have been critical pieces to both sides of the ball, and really all three sides of the ball with Jason Sanders. And then you make some, depth signings and then bring in a starting quarterback. It's just kind of weird to wrap your head around. I'm going to give them a C so far. I just don't really fully understand the process. But maybe it'll work out, right? Again, I'm not getting paid to be the GM. They know a lot more than I do. So hopefully that works out for them. But I'm going to give it a C for now. The Vikings, the big ones, bringing in Kyler Murray. Very similar to the Tua signing. Kind of takes that really cheap deal just because he's still owed money from Arizona. So he doesn't really have to gouge Minnesota. Sorry, he's still owed money from Arizona and doesn't need to gouge Minnesota for more money just because he still has money from his previous team. I really like that. I think he's going to really hope. Let me rephrase. I'm hoping he improves in that system. I don't think McCarthy's. I really like JJ McCarthy. I just don't know if he's quite ready to be a franchise quarterback. Maybe he will someday, but I think Kyler Murray is presumably your day one starter. We'll see. That's kind of the vibe I get. James Pierre, I love that signing at only $8.5 million a year. He had a career year this past year. I want to say in his like age 28 or 29 season, which is interesting. But he was incredible. I think he really fits that Brian Flores type, off coverage, read and react type defense. So that's a really good signing. Overall, I give the Vikings like probably an A minus, man. They lose those 2 defensive tackles they signed last year. I just don't think they quite fit the Brian Flores type approach, which is fine. But bringing Kyler Murray, bringing James Pierre, obviously you don't have a high quantity of signings, but I think the quality is very, very good. So I like what they've done. Patriots are Super Bowl runner-ups. Dobbs, that's a lot of money for Dobbs, but with the release of Stephon Diggs, I do think you needed to add to that receiver room, and the end of the first round isn't always the best place to do that. So I think Dobbs has been very solid. He's shown flashes of being, a top-tier caliber player. I think the Patriots are kind of in a similar spot to where the Packers have been over the past few years of just, maybe not having a dominant number 1 receiver, but having, a room full of 2s, maybe 3s. But that's worked out for Green Bay too. I mean, they've been a really good offense. I think he's another reliable target for Drake May. So I definitely don't hate it. We'll kind of see. Vera Tucker makes a lot of sense for an O-line that kind of needed revamping outside of Will Campbell. He's pretty flexible. He can play right tackle. He can play guard. Well, I think they signed him to play guard, but worst case scenario, he kicks out. Draymond Jones is a guy I was thinking of earlier from Baltimore. He had a career year this year as well. He gets a big payday for it. He was like the first signing of external free agency. It was like right when 11 o'clock hit, he was signed. So good for him. Talking on the heartstrings here, Kevin Byard reuniting with Vrabel. He was a guy I really wanted the Bears to bring back. Unfortunately, just couldn't get it done. It is what it is. I think it makes a lot of sense for him to go back with Vrabel and kind of finish his career there. Overall, I'd give the Patriots probably an A minus. Again, filling some pretty glaring needs along the offensive line and receiver rooms. Again, similar to some of these other teams I've mentioned, really giving themselves an opportunity to take some of the best players available in the draft, as opposed to really having to target specific needs. I think that's a good process. I'm happy with that. The Saints, honestly, have been one of my biggest winners of free agency. I think ETN is a perfect fit for this Kellen Moore offense. To me, he kind of does what you would hope Alvin Kamara would do, but he's just healthier and younger. 4 years, $52 million is pretty significant, but I think he's worth it. He's still like 26 or something like that. And they needed a true running back. There was a lot of, talk of them taking Jeremiah Love in the NFL draft. The interesting thing about that is, did they sign ETN thinking that, there's no way Love is going to make it? And if that's the case, where is he going to go? My next episode is going to be a mock draft, so we can get more into that later. David Edwards, we talked about him a little bit earlier. The Saints did have a guard need. I think they filled it really, really well here with a veteran in David Edwards. Again, significant amount of money, but you're getting a good player. You're adding to an already very, promising O-line unit. They have 2, bookend tackles. You get a solid presence in the middle. I think that makes sense. Caden Ellis, a very underrated signing. He gives you kind of that off-ball, on-ball type versatility for only $11 million a year after losing DeMario Davis. I think that makes a lot of sense. Noah Fant, rotational guy, fine. Bringing back Ridgeway, solid. Signing a punter. To be honest, I can't act like I know a whole bunch about punters, so I'm not even going to try. Overall, I'd probably give the Saints an A. I love what they've done so far. I think they've got nothing but better, and they still have a top 10 pick to go along with all of this. So I'm really excited to see what they can do next year. The Giants, a team that have been pretty active as well, bringing in Likely and Edmonds. 2 guys I think are solid contributors. I'm not sure if they're like franchise-changing type players, but especially after losing Okereke, I think Edmonds, slides right in as that kind of middle linebacker. Likely, I was actually kind of surprised that they were the team to bring him in. Obviously, he has a great connection with Harbaugh, but I really think Dart connected well with Theo Johnson last year. Maybe there's something about that relationship I don't know. But I was kind of, assuming that he'd be their top guy. But after giving Likely $40 million, it sounds like he will be. So, excuse me. Maybe that 1-2 punch will be really good. We'll see. Bringing back Illuminor, 3 years, $39 million. I do think that makes sense. This is the best O-line the Giants have had in quite some time. That's a pretty reasonable contract for Illuminor. He's getting up there in age, and he did just have the best year of his career. So we'll see if he can replicate that. Obviously, our guy Marcus, for a lot of you, I was hoping he'd slide in the right tackle spot. I still think there's a possibility of that, right? There's no reason that he can't still fight for that job. But, worst case scenario, if he's playing inside, you at the end of the day, you got to get your best 5 out there. So I think Illuminor does help them do that. We'll see. Newsome, after losing Cordell Flott in free agency, I think bringing in Newsome makes some sense. Ardarius Washington, a guy before injury that was really good. Patrick Ricard, He's just a giant at fullback. He's been one of the best fullbacks in the NFL over the past decade. He follows Harbaugh. We'll kind of see what the offense looks like under Matt Nagy, but we'll see. All right, Ricard's a versatile weapon. He's a really good in the run game. We'll kind of see how that plays out. They bring in Calvin Austin on a very reasonable deal. To me, that's kind of replacing that Wan'Dale Robinson role. Obviously, Wan'Dale walks and gets a lot of money with Tennessee. Calvin Austin kind of fits that smaller kind of slot type, underneath run after catch kind of player, but for a lot less money. So there's nothing wrong with that. I'd probably give the Giants a B. Nothing too earth shattering here, but I do think they've gotten better. Re-signing Evan Neal was one of the most surprising moves of free agency so far. If you had, told me to bet on one player that was going to leave his current team, it probably would have been Evan Neal. But somehow, some way, he is still there. They're still betting on him. Maybe with another head coach and a new offensive system, they can get the best out of him for his sake and the Giants' sake. I hope they do. We'll kind of see. The Jets, another team that's been, one of the biggest spenders. They trade for and extend Minkah Fitzpatrick. I like Minkah Fitzpatrick. I think he's at the very worst, solid at this point of his career. I do think his name value kind of outshines, his on-field value. So $40 million is a little rich for me. But at the very worst, he'll be a solid starter. Demario Davis comes back home. For those of you that didn't know, he started his career with the Jets before being, an all-pro caliber player for the Saints. I think that brings some stability, much-needed stability to a poor Jets defense, especially now that they're kind of pivot to Aaron Glenn's style. He's taken over that defensive play calling. So, these are kind of his guys now. Joseph Osai, who's kind of carved out a name for himself, even though he was on that horrible Bengals defense. He's carved out a pretty solid role and name for himself over the past 4 years. Former second-round pick, I believe, out of Texas. I think that makes some sense. Dylan Parham, after losing AVT and John Simpson, he's going to slide into one of those guard spots. That was a much-needed addition. So, again, they don't have to pigeonhole themselves into taking, a possible guard at pick 16 this year. Anyamata, fine. And Igbare, a guy I really like. He's kind of a versatile piece along the defensive line. Nashawn Wright, I was surprised that it only ended up being a $5 million price tag for him. He's a guy that, I anticipated the Bears letting walk. But only $5 million in a Jets scheme that presumably is going to play a lot more man coverage this year. His length, I think, will be very valuable to Aaron Glenn. So I'm really rooting for the guy. I'm hoping he can, earn himself an even bigger extension. Overall, I'd probably give the Jets an A. They had a lot of money to spend. They made meaningful additions, especially along the defense. And now, with the wealth of picks they have, they can really hope to add, true difference makers. So I really like the process. I think they're heading in the right direction. They do trade for Geno Smith. At the very worst, he's your starter this year, and you pick a quarterback at the top of the draft next year. But we'll see, right? I think overall they've done pretty well for themselves. The Eagles have been kind of a weird team, especially after signing Jordan Davis. That's a lot of money for Jordan Davis, but he's an unbelievable player. I think he's critical to their success on defense. The one thing that's been weird is that those Jalen Carter trade rumors have come up because of this. Obviously, Jalen Carter is an unbelievable player. I think he's a little bit more of a, we'll call it, polarizing personality. We'll see. I would be surprised if he ends up getting dealt. I think for at least this year, they'll keep him on board. Reek Woolen, this is the Reek Woolen spot. Only 1 year, $15 million. The Eagles had a pretty glaring need at CB3 last year. Pretty much if your name wasn't Cooper DeJean or Quinyon Mitchell, they were going after you, right? It didn't matter who the team was. It didn't matter who you were guarding. The opposing offense was going to throw at you just because of how good those other two guys are. So, despite Reek Woolen kind of having his ups and downs, especially this past year, he is better than what they had last year. So, again, I think that fills a need. I can't believe Brandon Graham is back after, retiring a year ago and then, kind of coming back this year. I was, pretty sure, he's kind of just going to chalk it at that point, but apparently not. He's about 100 years old. Doesn't really move me there. Ebiketie for only 1 year at $7 million. He kind of steps into that rotational pass rusher role. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think if a team is going to, make the most of a guy like that, the Eagles are a good one to do it. Other than that, nothing too crazy. They haven't traded A.J. Brown yet. I'm not sure if that's going to end up happening, but what I do know is if A.J. Brown is going to be traded, it makes a lot more financial sense for the Eagles to do it after June 1st. That's that key date when those cap numbers start to change. So I definitely, if I was an Eagles fan, I'd keep holding your breath. Maybe you really want him gone, but he's, your probably your best offensive player at this point. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him get dealt in a couple months, but we'll see. Overall, I give the Eagles a B. Nothing too crazy here. I think they've kind of addressed some of their needs, but haven't made anything, any earth-shattering moves. The Steelers, as we're kind of winding down here, like I mentioned earlier, they trade for Michael Pittman and then give him $60 million. I'm not quite sure Michael Pittman is worth $20 million a year, but they did have a pretty glaring need at wide receiver too. I think he does fit that. Despite being a bigger guy, he's kind of the opposite of DK Metcalf in the way of, like, DK Metcalf is that really athletic, field-stretching type player, and Michael Pittman's more of that bigger-bodied possession, kind of over the middle of the field type player. So I do think they will complement each other relatively nicely for whoever their quarterback's going to be. I'm assuming it's going to be Aaron Rodgers, but we'll see. Depends on what his relationship with Mike McCarthy looks like. Jamel Dean, bringing him in after losing James Pierre. That was like a really low-key signing to me. I think Jamel Dean was one of the better players on the market. So to get him into a defense that's already really, really good, or at least on paper is very, very good, that's a great signing. They do extend Cameron Hayward for $32 million. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but he is so good still at, getting into his late 30s that, I mean, I don't really know how you convince yourself that he's not worth it. Rico Dowdle's a weird one, man. To me, this more so tells me that the Caleb Johnson pick, they're just not happy with. Second round pick last year at Iowa. He was a guy I really liked coming out. I think he's more of that outside zone type of guy, and that's not really the To me, I think he's more of that, inside zone kind of explosive, man gap scheme type inside runner. And that's just not always the Arthur Smith way to go. We'll see. Asante Samuel Jr. has some inside-out versatility in the cornerback room. That makes sense on a $4 million deal after coming back after suffering that, I believe it was a back injury. Jaquan Brisker, again, man, to me, this is, and I've seen people tweet about this all day. Brisker, Byard, Nashawn Wright, Jonathan Owens, like all of these guys, CJ Gardner-Johnson, all of these guys getting 1-year deals for what I would say is less money than pretty much everybody thought they were going to get, to me tells you a lot about what the league thought of the Bears defensive back room. I know they, caused a lot of turnovers, kept us in games at points, but I think you're kind of getting the honest opinion of the other 31 franchises of how do they value these guys. So even though Jaquan Brisker goes to Pittsburgh on a manageable deal, he does have some pretty significant injury concerns, but he had a pretty good year this year, especially in the playoffs. So I wish, obviously, nothing but the best. I mentioned in my Bears episode that he was a guy that has absolutely bled orange and blue through his 4 years as a Chicago Bear. So I'm definitely going to miss him. Was hoping we could bring him back, but it is what it is. Cole Holcomb as a rotational linebacker. Darnell Savage is a bum. I can't even hide that one. I just don't think he's very good. He'll probably be a special teams guy. Overall, I'd probably give the Steelers a B. I do really like the Jamel Dean signing. Excuse me, I can't speak. But I think they did kind of overpay for Pittman a bit. And otherwise, you're kind of just at net zero. So I'll give him like an average, kind of a B. Or I guess C's average. But for my purposes, I'll call it a B. The Niners end up being a Mike Evans suitor. I'm kind of surprised by that. Obviously, I had them re-signing Juwan Jennings, who still hasn't been signed. We'll kind of see. I don't think that 49ers reunion is going to happen at this point. But Mike Evans, 3 years, $60 million. I think that is a very manageable number. Is he going to play another 3 years? I'd be surprised if he gets to that point. But I do think he brings something to the Niners that they haven't had. You could argue since Terrell Owens in that type of like true alpha number one receiver. I know that, at points, Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel were kind of that, but not to the point that Mike Evans has been throughout his career. So if he can stay healthy, he'll be an impactful player, no doubt. We'll just have to see. Obviously, they're the team that trades for Osa Odighizuwa. Again, this is a really good to me because, they, again, make it a little bit more flexible come draft night. They don't have to draft a defensive tackle now, at least not in the first, 1 to 3 rounds. So I think that makes sense. He's a really good player. They have a reunion with Dre Greenlaw. Obviously, that breakup didn't last long. It just didn't really work out for him in Denver. And with Fred Warner coming back from injury, you get those guys back together. I think that makes a lot of sense. They do re-sign Eddie Pinheiro. Been a really good kicker, man. And I think more now than ever, we have seen so many critical kicker like misses that it is very important, man. It sounds silly, but it's so important to have a kicker you can rely on, and you can rely on Pinheiro. So I like it. Vidarian Lowe, he was a kind of a spot starter for New England this past year, with the uncertainty around Trent Williams, which is just kind of hard to identify. You know, are they going to keep him? Are they going to trade him? Is he going to get cut? To be completely honest with you, I think I'm kind of 50-50 on whatever the possibility is, whether he's a Niner or not. But in the situation that he's not, I think at the very worst, Vidarian Lowe is like a starting caliber player. I'm not sure if he's the guy you want to build the offensive line around, but he's a solid player. And then after the Packers cut Nate Hobbs, they swoop in, pick him up on a 1-year deal. They do already have, a pretty good nickel corner, so I'm not sure what the plan with Nate Hobbs is going to be. Maybe just a rotational vet. Hopefully he can kind of turn it around. I don't mind the dart throw. Overall, I'd give the Niners, we'll call it a B+. They did bring in good players. It's just, how long are these guys going to play, especially, Evans and Greenlaw. But yeah, and then what are they going to kind of do at, the rest of their defensive line, especially with Bryce Huff retiring. He was their most consistent pass rusher last year, so that's still a huge need. Kind of TBD on that. Your Super Bowl champion, Seattle Seahawks, they are really playing the compensatory pick market. They bring back Shaheed, they bring back Drake Thomas, they bring back Josh Jobe. They sign Emmanuel Wilson from the Green Bay for a cheap deal. I'm surprised they let Kobe Bryant out of the building. I know to some of you that may sound kind of biased because obviously he went to my Bears. But again, going back to my Seahawks episode, I talked about how important he can be, was to Seattle's defense last year. He allows Eman Wari to be that free-flowing nickel defender. They do bring back Ty Okada, so I do think Ty Okada is a good player and can step into that role, but it's just kind of uncertain, right? So hopefully that happens for them. We'll kind of TBD on that. Obviously, they let Boye Mafe walk. They let Kenneth Walker walk. So they're going to get, a hefty amount of compensatory picks next year just because of the caliber of players they've lost. They also don't have very many draft picks in the 2026 NFL draft. So they're going to have to kind of make some things shake, right? I think they have players to replace the things they've missed. It's just a matter of, with the increased role, can those guys step up to the plate? And I'm going to trust the Seahawks and Mike McDonald that they can. So I'm going to give the Seahawks a B for now. I know they lost some really key players. I'm most concerned about running back, just especially with Charbonnet, probably going to be missing at least the first part of the year. We'll see. Maybe he's ready week 1. But I'm not sure regardless if he's a true RB1. That's definitely an area of possible improvement. So we'll see. Buccaneers haven't been super active quite yet. Reports say that they were super heavy into the Trey Hendrickson kind of sweepstakes. Unfortunately, just kind of missed out on that one. They do re-sign Cade Otton. I think he's about league average as far as tight ends go. They have a huge linebacker need, and Anzalone's been a solid player for Detroit over the past few years. So I think at the very worst, it's a good stopgap option. Kenneth Gainwell, I really love the fit with the Buccaneers. Obviously, they let Rachaad White walk. I really, the kind of dynamite potential they have with both him and Bucky Irving in the backfield, I really love that. I think if I was a Steelers fan, I'd be pretty upset that we let Gainwell go. He was their most consistent offensive contributor last year. So hopefully he can keep that up with Tampa Bay. They bring in A'Shawn Robinson from the Panthers. Alakeem Mohammed on a pretty cheap deal. I want to say he got like 10+ sacks last year, opposite of Aiden Hutchinson. If you look, his pass rush win rate numbers weren't especially through the roof, but he was a very productive as far as the stat sheet goes. And with a team that needs edge, I think that makes sense. They bring in Browning to be Baker's backup. With how Baker played last year, maybe Browning does get a real shot if he can't improve. We'll kind of see on that. Tennessee Titans. Oh, excuse me. I'd give the Buccaneers like a C+. They've made some okay signings. I really like the Kenneth Gainwell one, so maybe I'll give him a C+ just because of the Kenneth Gainwell thing. But other than that, I think they still have a lot of work to do. I think players are having trouble buying into what Todd Bowles is selling at this point. I was surprised that he was, is returning for this next season. I really thought he was kind of going to get the can this year. So they're in a tough spot, man. I'm not going to lie. A team that seemed to be so promising just a few years ago. we'll see, right? I'm not particularly confident, and everybody knows how much I love Baker Mayfield. Hopefully he can turn it around. We'll kind of see on that. The Titans have been like possibly the most active in free agency. Obviously $70 million is a lot of money for Wan'Dale Robinson, but he is coming off of his first 1,000-yard season. And I do think he is, as far as skill set goes, one of those like key players that the Titans were missing. Chimere DK being your deep threat, Alec Iomanner kind of playing that like outside the numbers possession, kind of 50-50 ball type player. But Wan'Dale Robinson gives Cam Ward an option, in those short to intermediate parts of the field. Those quick hitting routes, run after the catch, reliable hands. Wan'Dale Robinson got a lot of targets this year, man, and I think he's going to do that same thing for Cam Ward and the Titans. It is a bit pricey for me, but I do think he fills a need. So I don't mind it. John Franklin Myers, man, him going to a defensive line that already has Jeffrey Simmons. Going to a defensive line. Sorry about the camera. Jeez, stop there for a second. Him going to a defensive line that already has Jeffrey Simmons and is going to be coached by Robert Saleh is super, super fun. So we'll see. I really like that number for him too, $63 million. He's earned it. They bring in both Cordell Flott and Delonte Taylor to play corner. They clearly have a type at corner. They've brought in, multiple 6-foot+ corners. I think that's just kind of, what Robert Saleh is going to want to do. Neither guy is necessarily elite, but is absolutely an improvement, over what they had last year. You could throw Joshua Williams. He's the other Chiefs corner that I couldn't think of earlier. Bringing those three guys in, they completely overhaul the cornerback room. They actually just cut L'Jarius Sneed today, who just wasn't the player they were hoping for. Another former Chief, funny enough. They bring in Daniel Bellinger. They lose Chico Okonkwo, so Daniel Bellinger is going to be kind of that tight end too. I think that's fine. Jacob Martin, who was the Commanders' best pass rusher last year, or at least most productive. I think that's fine for $11 million. Austin Schlottman, after cutting Lloyd Cushenberry, he'll be fine, right? I'm not sure, again, if he's going to be your long-term center, but he's at least a stopgap option. Jordan Elliott is what it is. Fine rotational piece. I saw a tweet that said Robert Saleh refuses to coach football without Solomon Thomas on his team, which is kind of funny and kind of true, right? He traded for him very, very quickly. Just another rotational guy. Tony Adams, a vet. Trubisky, Money Mitch, former Bear. He'll be their backup. That's fine. Overall, I'd probably give the Titans an A-. I think they've made they're one of the few teams that have made like a lot of like splash, like very clearly like improve the team type signings. And they still have a lot of, top tier draft capital to continue adding, some of that superstar potential to the team. So I'm really excited to see what they do come April. And then lastly, another one of our absolutely, huge spenders in the Commanders. They give, Tunsil a huge extension. They're the team that kind of wins that Odafe Owe sweepstakes. I do think $25 million a year for Owe is a little bit rich. He was just okay for the Ravens, and then he gets traded to the Chargers and is incredible, right? So it just kind of depends. What do you want to bet on? Do you want to bet on those first few years where it just didn't seem like all the wheels were spinning, or whatever you want to say, right? Or do you want to bet on, what you saw most recently, which was a really, really good player? Obviously, we know what the Commanders want to do. They have a pass rush need. They fill it. Chico Okonkwo for $10 million a year, to me, again, is a little bit rich. But he is a very athletic, vertical threat type tight end. I think with Jaden Daniels, that's kind of a good situation for him to be in, so we'll see. Leo Chanel. I love Leo Chanel, again, Wisconsin legend, death row. For him to only get, $8 to $9 million on the open market, I know he hasn't necessarily been a linebacker one up to this point, and he probably will be now, or he surely will be now. But man, I just think, after 3 years of this contract, people are going to look silly, man. I think he's going to quickly become one of the premier inside linebackers in the NFL. And at, half to a third of what some of the top linebackers make. So really happy about that one. They bring in Tim Settle to be that interior defensive line presence. I think that makes a lot of sense. Amik Robertson, you add him as a potential nickel option in a really bad defensive back room. Nick Cross got a little bit picked on this year in the Colts defense, but again, this team was really bad in the back end, so I think Cross at least brings you, kind of a fresh face there. They signed both Kayvon Chason and Charles Omenihu. I saw a tweet, I believe it was from that franchise guy. So shout out Marcus for that one. But he said he wouldn't be surprised if Kayvon Chason is more productive in this defense than Odafe Owe is. And we'll see. I'm not sure if I'd quite go that far. But Kayvon Chason was really, really good for the Patriots last year. Over the past few years, he's kind of bounced around and been relatively productive. So I'm excited to see if he can kind of continue that trend here with the Commanders. They're the team that brings in Rachaad White. I think that makes a ton of sense. We'll kind of see. I'm not sure if this stops them from looking at a guy like Jeremiah Love in the first round. It is only 1 year, $2 million. But he has been a really good player, especially as a third down back. So I think that's fine. I think he reunites with Jaden Daniels, former Arizona State teammates. That's cool. Treylon Burks, I don't want to call it a career resurgence, but after having a really, really rough time with Tennessee after being a first-round pick, he actually played pretty well in his limited reps last year. So I think bringing him back on a 1 year, $4 million deal makes some sense. They bring back Diami Brown. I'm going to be completely honest. This is the Diami Brown being on the Commanders again is one of the first signings in this video where I'm like, I didn't even realize that happened. He was actually really good for the Commanders a couple of years ago. And then obviously gets, a bigger payday with Jacksonville last year. Unfortunately for him, he just really wasn't in their plans. So that's fine. He gets kind of reunited with the Commanders. Hopefully he can get back to form. Van Jefferson, fine, kind of a wide receiver 4 or 5 type player. They re-signed Jake Moody. I'm really happy for Jake Moody. He actually, helped beat the Commanders for the Chicago Bears this year. So kind of a small world there. After being a high draft pick for the Niners, he's kind of turning things around. That's cool for him. They just cut Marshawn Lattimore, which saves like $15 million or something crazy like that. I think Marshawn Lattimore's career is just kind of over. Formerly, absolutely unbelievable player. He's just not quite that anymore, which is fine. They save a lot of money. We'll kind of see where he lands. The Tyler Biadasz cut is weird to me. He was a really, really good player for them. I mean, obviously he's not like an all-pro or anything, but on an offensive line that, has some really strong pieces, I was surprised that he's the guy that they were willing to get rid of. We'll see if they maybe address that in the draft. I would be surprised if they didn't. Just kind of, how premium of a pick do they want to spend on a center. But overall, I'd still give the Commanders probably an A- or an A. Just, when you bring in this many players and spend this much money, it's pretty hard not to get a high grade just because, the odds are you are making improvements to the roster. They're another team that doesn't have that much draft capital. So I think for them in particular, it's especially important that they, fill some glaring needs in free agency and then allow themselves to take bigger swings in the draft. So again, I've said that multiple times. I really like that process. Hopefully that works out for them. So yeah, this is kind of my recap here, just giving some of my thoughts, kind of recapping some of these things for maybe people that don't keep up as closely as I do for free agency. Hopefully, I gave you a chance to kind of listen to my thoughts on your favorite team. Regardless of what your favorite team is, I would love for you to kind of hop in the comments, tell me, what are your thoughts on what your team has done so far? What do you hope your team addresses in the draft? Yeah, so that's going to kind of do it for me. My next episode is going to be a post-free agency mock draft, which I'm really, really excited for. That's kind of my favorite thing to do is those mock drafts. So look out for that. Maybe let me know in the comments who's the guy you're looking for in those mock drafts. But yeah, overall, it's going to do it for me. I really appreciate you guys kind of locking in for this one. I know it's a little bit different than what you're used to. But yeah, let me know if you got any questions, concerns, suggestions in the comments. And I'll see you guys later. Thank you very much.